The next type of case research design we'll be looking at is what I am calling the case pattern. I don't actually know if anyone else calls it that, but I was looking for a name. It isn't exactly the same as a replication because it tends to involve more cases, and you tend to know less about the cases going in than you would in a normal replication design. But I've designed a number of case research projects using this technique, and we'll be looking at a couple of examples that came out of one project once we get to the readings. What we'll be covering in this video is as follows. First, I am going to sort of give you an overview of the objectives of the sort of pattern design case research. Then I will talk about how these differ from quantitative research because in some respects, once you start to get a lot of cases, it starts to look like a quantitative research study. Then I'll talk about how it differs from replication designs because obviously as you get more than one case, you start thinking it looks like a replication. Then we'll go over the two different papers that we'll be looking at. And they're two papers that stem from the same research project. I just had to break it up and look at different types of conclusions and phenomena in each of the paper. And this is one of the things that can happen in case research is that you accumulate a large amount of data, and it's also often quite possible to slice and dice it in multiple ways. And certainly whenever I've done significant studies, I have typically found 2, 3, 4 papers coming out of the study, each of which focusing on a different aspect of the study and on different channels. But in this case, the two papers were actually published by the same journal. So a pattern case research design involves multiple cases. The first pattern design project I did was my dissertation. It involved a dozen. I have done pattern design cases with 103 potential sites. That is the research that will be described in the two papers. And I've had patterns that, had 20 or so. So there really is not a precise number associated with it. And an important difference between pattern design and replication design is in replication design, you typically know a bit about the cases before you go in to make sure the case is a good replication. In a pattern design case, you probably have no idea where a case is going to fit in the pattern until you actually get into the research. But at any rate, when we're doing pattern design, we're working on conceptual schemes or theory once again. Very often the patterns can be really good for developing classifications and identifying different types of cases within the collection. And you may be able to acquire some evidence of significance if you've got enough cases. So then we start crossing the border into quantitative research. A very important thing about pattern case research is identifying boundaries where behaviors change. And if you can identify variables that help determine where behaviors change, that can be very important. When you identify interactions, that can be important. So you can think of it, if you've got one of these territories with multiple peaks, high extrinsic complexity, what we're trying to do is sort of figure out where the different peaks are, and what are the variables that cause you to go into a valley or switch peaks. Finally, it promotes comparison, and whereas you can do very detailed one-way comparisons when you're doing a replication study, and you can compare between two different cases. This allows you to observe a lot more behaviors potentially, and as I mentioned before, it has both qualitative and quantitative elements that you can leverage. Given that we have large numbers of cases in some cases when we're doing this pattern research, how does it really differ from sort of quantitative research where our focus is statistical analysis? Well, one element is in case selection. When you're doing pattern research, you're not actually assuming a random sample. Your sample is more likely to be opportunistic, and you're not necessarily planning to generalize from your sample. Rather, you're trying to detect patterns within your samples, and you want a very wide variety of cases so that you can hopefully determine, where different patterns start and end. A second difference is the observations. In quantitative research, your observations tend to be, numeric variables pulled out of surveys. In pattern, we're doing triangulation. In other words, just the way we would in normal research, we're going to try to get our data from different sources. I meant normal case research. And normally we'll get both quantitative and qualitative data from the sites. Again, it's very much a sort of mixed method approach. Finally, in terms of our analysis, we're tend to do a lot of exploratory analysis and hypothesis testing. Now, when you're doing quantitative research, if you're going to do it really rigorously, you have to lay out your hypotheses before you use the tests, and then once you do the tests, you accept or reject the hypotheses, but you're not allowed to play around with the data before you test the hypotheses. Mind you, that particular practice is honored more in being broken than actually being followed, but that's what you should do for rigorous quantitative research. Like most forms of case research, the case pattern tends to be exploratory, and so you can do a lot of different hypothesis, well, not hypothesis testing, but you can come up with a lot of ideas based upon how the patterns break out. And a lot of times you're more interested in cross-tabulation and laying cases out in 2x2 grids to try to identify patterns as opposed to doing it through tests of statistical significance. So, how does pattern research differ from the case replication that we talked about in the previous presentation? Well, first, case selection. Replication, your observations are chosen very carefully, and there's generally a small number of them. As I mentioned at the introduction here, in pattern research, you'll tend to have more cases, and you won't necessarily know that much about the cases before you start the investigation. And as a consequence, you can't really lay out a systematic replication design because you don't actually know what you're going to find until you get into the actual research. Another difference is in the observations. In pattern research, they'll necessarily be more limited in scope because you just don't have as much time per observation. Of course, I guess that is a function of budget, but certainly in my pattern research, I haven't had as much time for observations. And you're also going to want to get some categorical variables because when push comes to shove, you're going to want to break your cases up into categories to look at the patterns. Do successful cases tend to have one be in one or two categories, while unsuccessful cases in a couple of other categories? What is the meaning of success? I mean, all of these things are sort of challenging questions, and if you're going to deal with a lot of cases, you need some hard variables. They can be qualitative, but you have to basically assign values so that you can break the categories up. Finally, in terms of the analysis, in pattern research, it's really going to be patterns of cases that provide a basis for the conclusions you have, you're going to have a tougher time making arguments for causality. This is really exploratory. Once you've done your pattern research, then what you may want to do is go in and do some replication research or individual case research to try to get as many sources of evidence as possible for the phenomenon you think you observed. So it's harder to separate out causality from correlation in pattern-based research, but I would argue you'll still probably do better than you would in a pure quantitative design in terms of separating out causality and correlation. So the first reading you will look at is called Early Expert Systems, Where Are They Now? And this was a pattern case design that was inspired by a smaller pattern I noticed when I was looking at 12 cases in my dissertation. And because I'd noticed that pattern, I wanted to investigate it more systematically. So what I did was I took a list of systems from a book that was published in 1988, and these were, quote, successful expert systems. And so I thought, well, let's see, this was published in 1988. The year is now 1993. 5 years have passed. Let's see what happened to those systems. There was no sampling logic involved. There were 97 systems that were in the US. I decided to limit international systems because we were still paying for phone calls then. And of those 97 systems, I believe I managed to get information on 81 of them, which is basically using phone interviews. And I had multiple variables for assessing whether a system was successful or not, because one of the big challenges that you often have in case research is assessing success. The observations were made from both archival research. So what I did before I started calling organizations was I found out everything that had been written on each system. Some of the systems had dozens of articles written on them. Some of the systems just had one or two things and, PR blurbs. Remember, this is before the days of the World Wide Web. In fact, the internet was unknown to most people at the time I conducted this investigation. So basically, this involved library work and card catalogs, and I had a couple of research assistants trying to help me identify sources. It's a long paper. Rather than reading the entire case, again, look for specific questions. The first case was focused on a sort of a big picture of what caused expert systems to succeed or fail in the long run. And one of the things I was interested in this particular study was whether it was principally a result of limitations of the technology or if it involved more human factors. And so that was the focus of this first paper. The second paper you'll be looking at was drawn from the same data source, but it was looking at a different theory. In this particular case, it was testing hypotheses related to how motivation changed based on the nature of the task change that occurred when the expert system was implemented. And the guiding theories for this came from general motivation research and job enrichment research. And my general hypothesis was that when users did not change before and after a system was implemented, what we would tend to find was that motivation, if a system increased the intrinsic motivation of the task, it would tend to be used much longer than if the system made the task less interesting. So For this particular research, there were enough observations so I was able to do some statistical tests. So this report looks a lot more like a quantitative report, but I did use triangulation during the interviews to try and increase the reliability. And in particular, anytime an interviewee's response was different from what I expected based on my previous literature review, I would ask him or her about it. After the interviews were completed, I sent a summary to each person by mail, and they came back to me if there were any changes. And I sent out copies of the research to everyone involved once the research was completed, looking for feedback before I published. And all of these things were an attempt to deal with the question of reliability and validity, which is always a challenge with case studies. So here's the usual caveat, use the quiz to answer questions about the paper. Do not try to read it from scratch. Give it a quick skim beforehand so you know where things are, but then we're not trying to force feed you this research. We're using it as an example of design.